Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to have a look at the respiratory system. Now the respiratory system is located in our thoracic cavity, and basically we're going to have a look at the concept of respiration and how the lungs work. When we look at the process of respiration, we look at the concept that the body takes in oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. So when we take a breath in, we're putting oxygen into our body, and when we take a breath out, we're removing carbon dioxide. So respiration is the process by which the body takes in oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. Respiration is a process that occurs practically in all living cells. It uses oxygen as a vital ingredient to free energy from food and can be characterised by the following equation. So we have glucose from our food and oxygen from the air that we breathe in, and that gets transferred to carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, which then gives us energy and water to survive or to create movement. To understand the concept of respiration a little bit better, we're going to have a look at the respiratory system. And the respiratory system is responsible for the exchanges of gases between the air that we breathe and the blood that circulates our body. The passage from which air goes from the nose to our lungs can be described as follows. Air containing oxygen from the atmosphere can either enter our body through our nose or our mouth. And when it enters through the nose, it passes through the nasal cavities, which is warmed up, moistened, and filtered by any foreign material. So the little hairs on the inside of your nose acts as a filter to filter out any dust or any other particles that you may have breathed in. From the mouth of the nasal cavity, the air then goes through the pharynx or the throat, and it serves as a common passage for air to the trachea, which is otherwise known as the windpipe. It leads from the nasal cavity to the larynx, which is our voice box. The trachea is a hollow tube which is surrounded by cartilage to strengthen it. And after entering the chest cavity, the trachea divides into a right and left tube, which we call the bronchioles, which lead to the right and left lung. The lungs are two bag-like organs that are situated on either side of the heart, so one for the left and one for the right. They are enclosed in the thoracic cavity and protected by the ribs at the sides and the sternum at the front, and the vertebral column at the rear. The diaphragm is a soft tissue or muscle at the base of the lungs, which aids in breathing. Now we're going to have a look at lung function. Now, our lungs allow us to breathe, and by breathing, air comes in and out of the lungs, and it's controlled automatically by the brain. And what's more important is that it involves two phases. We have inspiration and we have expiration. So inspiration is when we breathe air into the lungs, and expiration is the concept of moving air out of the lungs. So when we breathe air into the lungs, our lungs increase in size. When we breathe out, the lungs obviously decrease in size. When we breathe air in, the diaphragm, which is the muscle that sits at the bottom of the lungs, contracts, becoming flatter. And then when we breathe air out, that very same muscle relaxes and becomes a little more cone-shaped. So inspiration, air moves into the lungs and the lungs increase in size, and expiration, air moves out of the lungs and the lungs decrease. To understand how oxygen goes from the air into our blood, we need to have a closer look at what the human lungs are actually made up of. And they're actually made up of what we call bronchi, bronchioles, and our alveolus. Imagine that the bronchus are like big tree roots that deliver oxygen to all the leaves, and in this case we're looking at the bronchioles as the leaves, and on the very tip of the surface of those leaves or the bronchiole is our alveoli, and they're tiny little air sacs which are very thin, which is where the oxygen goes from the air and gets transported into the blood. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported from the alveoli and the blood through what we call the capillaries, which they surround the alveoli. Having a closer look at the capillary, when they're not wrapping the alveoli, this is what they could look like. So the blood comes from the body. It's got carbon dioxide in it, and it comes from the body, from the veins. When it then gets oxygenated by the oxygen or the air that we breathe in and comes out through the alveoli and the lungs, that blood then becomes oxygenized and goes out through the arteries and sends oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So you can see here, this is sort of like where the gas exchange occurs in the capillaries. This gas exchange is a two-way process and is known as diffusion. We also see a similar gas exchange where we have oxygen getting transferred into the cells to provide energy.